Hello, everyone. So today I'm going to jump right into it. This lecture is titled Church in Conquest Themes and Frameworks. There's a lot to talk about, and we are going to have the opportunity to unpack it in class in different moments and in your discussion and in your journals. But hopefully, this uh, attempt to frame it with some themes and also some details will give you something to engage with in a big picture way. So I invite you to simply listen. I'm not going to share any images for this one, so you can walk around your house. You can go for a walk, you can fold your laundry, whatever you want. If you want to take notes, that's fine. There are lecture notes that you can use here, and I'm probably going to stay pretty close to the lecture notes for this one, but I can't promise that entirely. But feel free to just listen and maybe jot down questions or jot down particular things that seem interesting, intriguing, or confusing to you, and we can deal with them later. Okay, so a few main points that I want to make today. The first is this, and forgive me for looking at my notes there on screen. I know it's always a little weird. If you are looking at me, um, you're going to see the side of my face a little bit. So um, the first point I want to make is that the church, Christian symbols and ideas, clergymen and theologians, right from the beginning, played paradoxical roles in the relationship between Spaniards and indigenous people in the 16th century. I say paradoxical rather than contradictory. We talked about this a little bit in class, because they all came out of a paradigm that fit together as a whole, but within this paradigm, there were complications and ambiguities and things that appear very different from one another. So things that seem to contradict each other don't seem like they would be a part of the same paradigm, especially from our modern perspective, actually really were. And that's part of what I want to unpack a little bit today. So, the ideas and the debates about Spain's right to rule were fundamentally based in a belief in the fundamental truth of Christianity and in a worldview in which political power and religious authority were intimately linked. We can call this a kind of theology of empire. But along the way, religious thinkers like Francisco de Vitoria, whom you read about in primary sources, were troubled by doubts and ambiguities about the extent and the rightness of Spanish rule. Vitoria was elaborating an ethics of empire in which he was establishing under what circumstances and through what methods it was ethical for Spaniards to rule and for the crown to require conversion to Christianity. So a question for discussion is how far could someone like Vitoria, within the historical context he found himself in, could go in questioning Spain's right to rule? But this was part of the debate that was located in Spain and Europe. Another part of this development of an ethics of empire also appeared in the form of voices of people in Latin America, people witnessing what was really happening there. Some of these voices strongly criticized Spanish violence and abuses enacted on indigenous people. The main voice that became known for this was that of Bartolomé de las Casas, who you've also encountered so far, but there were others as well. All of this was part of an ideology that held that Christianity was the one true religion and that God had led Spain to conquer the New World. And plenty of clergymen acted in ways that appeared to be much more interested in furthering the power and wealth of Spain and individual Spaniards than in the spiritual or physical well-being of native peoples. However, a great many churchmen also believed that God had given the church in Spain a very real responsibility to protect and help the people that they found in the Americas. And this really is on display, and the kind of confusion and trauma and tragedy that these clergymen found themselves sharing with Indigenous people, not experiencing it in the same way, of course, in the stories that you are reading in Jennifer Shepherd Hughes's book, The Church of the Dead. Uh, Most of us today probably find the clergyman's ways of helping and protecting to be condescending, culturally imperialist, racist. I know a lot of people find it even hard to believe that they were sincere looking at them from our vantage point. But it is still true that the main efforts to curb the abuses of Spanish colonists and to pass laws protecting Native people from those abuses were brought about by priests and theologians. That's the first point I want to make. So basically, to return, all of those things that I just said were within the idea that the church and all things included in what we might name the church, Christian symbols, ideas, clergymen, and theologians, right from the beginning played a paradoxical and very complicated role in the relationship between Spaniards and indigenous people as colonial society is being developed. The second point I want to make is that Spanish conquerors brought with them and asserted a worldview that is very hard for us to relate to, in which there could be no room for multiple truths, no room for doubt, in which there could not exist more than one way to understand the spiritual realm. This was a particular epistemology. Epistemology refers to both the study of knowledge and to a particular way of knowing. I'm using it in the second sense here to describe a particular way of knowing, a way of seeing and understanding that is bigger than the level of opinions or beliefs that usually change in the course of a lifetime. So we tend to think about an epistemology as something that we might not even be able to recognize that we're in. It's sort of like the air we're breathing and the water we're swimming in, etc. And it tends to be something that doesn't change easily, something that lasts for a generation or two or more. Um, and so, of course, the boundaries of those ways of knowing are very fluid within, and the edges of them change. I'm getting a little bit philosophical here, but there tends to be certain things that we who are living within a particular, Foucault called it an episteme. So it's more than just an era, more than just a culture, but existing within some kind of boundary of a way of knowing, uh, that there tend to be things that we just really can't question because we don't even know that they're assumptions. We don't even know that they're a bounded way of knowing until they get questioned. And this is one of those moments in which epistemologies were in great conflict. I mean, the moment that we're talking about right now here. So the Spaniards, people who were becoming Spaniards at this time, shared an epistemology that was very different from those of the people that they encountered. And this epistemology did not allow them, at least this is what it looks like looking back. I have some questions about this, but for the purpose of discussion, it may be the case that this epistemology that was forming, that this epistemology that people were increasingly investing in, did not allow them to consider that native religion and ways of understanding the universe could have real validity. Cultural relativism did not exist for these Spaniards in general, writ large, at least not in ways that they could put into words or consciously reflect upon. Nonetheless, I think it is the case that this epistemology of ultimate truth was in crisis at this time. And I also think another way of thinking about it is that it was actually in formation. So it was in formation and crisis at the same time. There existed more problems and conflicts and ambiguities in Spaniards' beliefs in one true religion than we might immediately recognize when we look at the writings of this era. So, in other words, perhaps a better way of saying that is that the historical record presents us with an epistemology that doesn't have a lot of wiggle room. And this is something that, becomes the basis of colonial society. However, when we think about the contexts that we already know about, uh, both in terms of what came before this moment, and then also when we think about the realities on the ground of what was happening, around these individual Spaniards and who they were in terms of being a very small minority within this world that they had entered and that they were very probably, confused and disoriented within. I think common sense requires us to at least question what the historical record seems to present. And scholars are doing that. And that's part of what Jennifer Shepherd Hughes is looking at, and ways of reading the historical record that invite us to ask new questions. So, first of all, in terms of the context that we know about, the Spaniards had come from a world in which there were competing claims to religious truth. Islam, Judaism, Christianity, as well as major heresies, and starting in 1517, the Protestant Reformation was threatening to split the Christian church. Second of all, they were coming face to face with an entire world and vast numbers of people who had never heard of Christianity and had a way of understanding the universe that was radically different from their own. So some of the assertions of one single truth may have been uh, may have been coming from an anxiety about these realities as much as any deep conviction that there was only one truth. And I believe both of these things were the case. That's my second point. So once again, the second point is that the Spanish conquerors brought with them and at least and asserted a worldview that is hard for us to relate to, in which, at least theoretically, there could be no room for multiple truths, no room for doubt, in which there could not exist more than one way to understand the spiritual realm. The third point is that this epistemology, this way of knowing, though it did not allow Spaniards to entertain the notion that perhaps there was more than one way to understand the universe, um, did have something important in common with Native American ways of knowing, with indigenous ways of knowing, that was very different from late modern European and Euro-American ways of knowing in the 19th and 20th centuries, and I would say also in the 21st century. And this is that both Europeans and Native Americans thought it was fully possible and, in fact, common that the spiritual realm was present and real and affected the material world. The ways of understanding the presence of the spiritual was very different between them, but all of them thought it was powerful and present. So, underneath this point, I have a few things to say here. The Spaniards described the spiritual realm as the supernatural, and to them it was made up of the power of the devil and his demons, or the power of God and his angels. Miracles were real. The devil was a literal, real, and powerful presence in the world. And the battle between these forces erupted on the physical scene and in the material world all of the time. Indigenous people thought there was a seamless relationship between nature and divinity, so it wasn't supernatural. And there was an intimate relationship between God and humans, too. And the power of the gods was not so easily divided between good and bad. Rather, everything was all part of a sacred whole that was constantly moving and shifting and changing. It was precarious, and people, animals, nature, and the spiritual realm all participated in the balancing of the universe. So they had different explanations for things, but they all thought it was totally plausible that the spiritual was behind the things that they were observing. So when the Spaniards encountered native beliefs, they did not, as later Europeans would in the 19th and 20th centuries, when encountering cultures different from their own, describe these beliefs as irrational, primitive, and completely imagined. They called them superstitious, but very often believed that they were caused by the devil. Sometimes they thought that the priests were fooling the common people, but this was just one explanation of two possibilities that were equally plausible. When indigenous people heard or saw what they understood to be divine forces and or gods or energies, Spaniards didn't usually doubt that people had really experienced these things. They thought that either the priests in the service of the devil were fooling people, or they thought that the devil, and when I say priests, I'm using the word that Spaniards used to translate religious authorities and leaders and experts of indigenous communities. So they thought that either these religious authorities or these experts were fooling people, or they thought that the devil himself or demonic forces and demons were actually manifesting these voices, these visions, these apparitions, these experiences, etc., that indigenous people were describing. The debate between whether native priests or spiritual experts were fooling people or the devil was actually causing the supernatural event was important because it said something about how powerful a hold the devil was thought to have in this particular region or a particular region within it among a particular people. It said something also about whether all the people could be blamed for communing with the devil or only the leaders, the spiritual leaders. But in all of these scenarios, it was not hard for Spaniards to believe that supernatural events did happen. And this is very important for us to keep in mind if we are to understand uh, if we understand this history. And finally, so that was the third point I want to make. And let me return to what I mean by that, is um, that even though the epistemology that the Spaniards are at least representing, maybe bringing with them, did not uh, allow them to truly entertain other ways of knowing as represented by indigenous people. Nonetheless, they had something in common with indigenous people that is different from perhaps what we hold, or at least perhaps what people in the 19th and 20th, and from much of, well, that later modern Europeans and Euro-Americans would hold, which is that Spaniards had no problem believing that what they named as the supernatural, what we might name as spiritual, did have material existence and did participate in human history and human daily life all the time. That was the third point. The fourth point, which is my last one that I want to make today in this lecture, and then I will record another piece getting into some details. So finally, I want to impress upon you all that this 16th century history is not a history in which all participants are equally known to us. We know very, very little about the perspective of indigenous people. When we read about the stories of the conquistadors, foot soldiers in the Andes, desecrating sacred places, for instance, we can glean from the reports that the Andean people were shocked and dismayed, but we don't know what they made of the situation. Were the Spaniards just like Incan lords who had punished Huacas, who had angered them by destroying their sacred places and killing the priests who served them? Or were they, now, if you don't know what I mean by Huacas, you need to return to some of the readings, but we can talk about this in class as well. Huacas were places or objects that had a kind of density of spiritual meaning, as a quick way of talking about them, which was important to the cosmology of Andean people and the Incan people as well. But the Incan overlords of Andean subject peoples engaged with Huacas in particular ways that both validated their existence and their power and the relationship that Andean people had with them, and also sometimes undermined particular Huacas in order to establish imperial control. But the Incas did not challenge their existence, did not attack them completely in the ways that Spaniards did. So the question is, did Andeans understand this when they saw the desecration of Huacas and sacred spaces? Did they understand that the Spaniards were something completely new? Did they see them as barbarians who were totally ignorant of the power of the sacred, which for them was a given, who were so uncultured and rude that they dared to treat such holy places with disrespect like this? Or were they powerful beings, almost like the gods of their own spiritual histories, who had no fear of other gods and therefore challenged them in this way? We don't know what they thought of them. We really do have no way of knowing completely, but historians are, in very careful and sophisticated ways, continuing to ask these questions and have come up with various theories and propositions. Years later, native accounts of the conquest, particularly in Mexico, would be gathered, and certainly some oral tradition is preserved in these accounts. But here, these are stories told in retrospect, after the conquest was a done deal, and in most cases, after epidemic diseases had begun to kill 90% of people in particular communities in the Valley of Mexico and other densely populated places. These were stories trying to make sense of what had already happened. We can learn from them, but for the most part, what Native Americans thought about what was happening, their interpretations of the ways that Spaniards treated their sacred truths and practices, and what they thought of as in the in about the very early introduction of Spanish Christianity remains fairly obscure to us. That is what I have to say in terms of framing content, comments, commentary. And the next lecture will look a little more deeply into some details about structuring colonial bureaucracy and the role of the church and the state in that process.